Well, welcome to all of you for the fourth session of the Singapore Perspectives Conference 2021 Reset. My name is Matthew Matthews. I'm from the Institute of Policy Studies. If you've been with me in the last few sessions, you'd have enjoyed the varied presentations. It has provided a lot of insight. In our session today will also be very insightful, and you will take home lots of key thoughts which will help us as we think about Singapore in the years to come. If you are joining us, just want to remind you that we'll be submitting our questions to the panelists using Pigeonhole. There'll be in the question submission section on this forum page. We also want to remind you to ask your questions in a respectful and safe manner. We would like you to focus on the issues at hand. The forum today is titled Identity and Cohesion. This is very much the heart of who we are as a people. There's no question that Singaporeans understand that societal cohesion is crucial to our economic future, actually our very survival. But we do have to deal with the substantial diversity that's presented before us. Diversities which are there because of our different racial, religious backgrounds, our migration histories, our different class backgrounds, and also the other array of diversities. While Singaporeans treasure our diversity, see this as an integral part of our national identity, also cognizant that identities need to be managed. Rights sometimes have to be given up if we're going to ensure harmonious coexistence. While we've been able to maintain high levels of social cohesion, it's not clear how things will pan out in the next decade. We take a leaf from the tumultuous social relations we see in other parts of the world and the role of identity politics in exacerbating fault lines. There's quite a bit to be concerned about. And there's no question that the COVID pandemic worldwide has widened fault lines. One wonders what it will take to allow our society to continue to experience solidarity. For everyone here to feel a sense of belonging as one people, one nation, especially in the face of many pressures, some of which are external to Singapore. A strong national identity is certainly one way to protect our social cohesion. But we should think about what constitutes national identity, especially since many Singaporeans live abroad now. And we also have many who have come to us as immigrants and subsequently become naturalized. What really then makes a Singaporean? Is it tied to physical space, connection to the local community, a set of memories, a shared core values? We also need to find ways to navigate the relationships between people of different backgrounds, whether it's racial, religious, cultural, other forms of differing backgrounds. And we need to find ways to be able to bridge these gaps between generations, between value systems. So quite a few things that we need to think about, especially if we think about Singapore in the next decade. We have two esteemed speakers and two discussants who will provide us important input for our deliberations. They'll both explain the challenges that we'll be faced with, taking note of trends in the international and the Singaporean context. They'll also provide us ideas about the way forward. So our presenters are Professor Joel Kotkin, who is the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University and also Executive Director of the Urban Reform Institute. He's got a recent book, The Coming Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. We also have Ambassador Muhammad Alami Musa, who is Singapore's non-resident ambassador to the People's Republic, Democratic Republic of Algeria. He's also concurrently the head of studies in interreligious relations and plural societies program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He's also the president of the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. We have Ms. Fang Mei Lin, who is the co-founder of People-Centered Internet, which carries out global initiatives to make the internet more people-centric. We also have Professor Daniel Goh, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Deputy Head of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. What we'll do is we'll hear from Professor Kotkin and then Ambassador Alami. They'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll have our discussants share their thoughts. We'll have Mei Lin go first, and then Daniel. So let me ask Professor Kotkin if you would like to begin the presentation,
Sure.
please.
Well, of course, I'm speaking at a very awkward time as an American. We've experienced a very difficult period in our history, and some of this has to do with cohesion and the identities or various identities that are really in conflict. But I'm going to sort of surprise people by saying that I think that ultimately we'll work it out. We've, you know, I went to Berkeley in the early 70s, so I know what a very contentious environment is. I actually experienced and covered the 92 LA riots. And yet, despite all this, I think that there, you know, first of all, this is a very different country. Obviously, it's an enormous country, and it has, you know, 330 million people. And we're changing tremendously. So I'm going to try to get into that right now. But if we can put up the PowerPoint, that would be great. And the first, if we go to the first slide, because my vision isn't good enough to read that, but I mean, basically what we're seeing is that Singapore has a model, has something to offer. And I think that Lee Kuan Yew understood this from the very beginning. And there are things that you've done in Singapore that we would never do. It would be unconstitutional for us to do in the United States. We couldn't say, well, you only this ethnic group has to come in this percentage in a housing project. There are many protections. And, you know, having studied the history of Singapore, I think, you know, Lee Kuan Yew was quite correct in having to do some of the things he did. We're a very different situation, but there's a lot that we can learn from, I think, from Singapore. And when I worked on projects, I had the pleasure of working with people from Indian backgrounds, people from Malaysian backgrounds, people from Chinese backgrounds, and it all worked out pretty well. So there is a lot that we can learn. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes Americans don't think we have anything to learn, but I think we do. But on the other hand, I think that we are by far the largest multiracial country in the world, and I think that and we have had we get more immigrants than basically the rest of the world put together historically. So we have a lot of issues that we still have. So we go to the next slide. So first, let's just talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe. Europe has been historically a place that sent people to America, to Australia, Canada. By the way, the other two societies that are similar to us. You know, I know them both well. I've done a lot of work in Australia, plus my wife's Canadian. So I think that what's happened in Europe is that they've had a sudden and very large migration of people from all over the world. It's also happening in the context of a diminishing population, very low fertility rate, and they've had an enormous problem adjusting to that. You know, a French person is first of all French, and you know, a young African immigrant is being taught in school our ancestors, the Gauls. Well, obviously, that person, their ancestors weren't Gauls. And, you know, we used to do that in the US. We do a lot less of it now. We understand the role of the minorities. And if you go to the next slide, one of the biggest issues in Europe has been the tremendous opposition to immigration that has emerged in Europe. We now see, you know, sort of nativist parties, the Front National in France, the Swedish Democrats, the True Finns. This has become a major crisis, and Europe's solution has been basically to cut off immigration, and even socialist governments like in Denmark have been cutting off immigration. So they're having somewhat of a difficult time being able to integrate these new groups. And as we well know, Europe has had a very difficult history. Many of the people who, for instance, originally came to Germany from Poland and Russia were eventually people who were exterminated, and that's not a very pleasant picture. So Europe has a very different situation. Now, it's very true that over, if you look at history, England and France and the Netherlands have done a little bit better job. They have had people coming in, but never at the numbers that came in all of a sudden, particularly as a result of the Syrian conflict. So not to say that the US is doing better, but it's a different trajectory. And the question of identity is somewhat differently expressed. And the one thing one can say about the United States at its best is that as one British historian said, it's a nation born as an idea. It's not a nation born because my relatives came from somebody's relatives came from Plymouth Rock, and and my parents, my grandparents came from the shtetl in Russia. I mean, they're still Americans. So if we go to the next slide. So this has obviously been a very tough year for the US, and we're going through a tremendous identity crisis. I mean, the New York Times, which was once a respectable newspaper, has now had a situation where there is and I think it's really unfortunate, where they've come up with a history of the United States as if the entire history of the United States was about racism. And racism existed, but you cannot build a country by destroying your own past. It would be like in Singapore to reject the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew and then say, well, now we're going to do something completely different. That's part of your inherent identity. Go to the next slide, please. The US has gone through an enormous ethnic change. And we've gone from a period like in my mother's generation, the country was about 10% non-white. In my daughter's generation, her granddaughter's generation, it's going to be about 40 to 50% non-white. That is an enormous, enormous change. And some Americans have had a hard time with it. Go to the next slide. But I think that there are some positive things. Sometimes you wish that the politicians from Donald Trump and to the Democratic leadership would all go away, because I think Americans by themselves at the local level do a much better job of getting along than our political leaders and our media people do. Fundamentally, we have very different attitudes. One of the ones I look at is interracial marriage. Interracial marriage was considered appropriate by 4 or 5% of Americans not very long ago, 50 years ago. Today, it's widely accepted, particularly accepted among young people. If we go to the next slide. What we're seeing is what I like to call the multiculturalism of the streets. I have to give credit to my friend Sergio Munoz for coming up with that. On the street level, just even in my own operation, here at Chapman, my assistant is Persian. My social media person is from Pakistan. There doesn't seem to be, and I hopefully other people who've been to the U.S., it's actually amazing how people get along and how much intermarriage there is, how much interracial dating. We had a party from my daughter's 15th birthday, and it was the United Nations, and it wasn't planned. It's just that's who she goes to school with here in Orange County, California. Once a very white place, now about 50% non-white. Go to the next slide. So basically what we're seeing is Americans as a group actually think immigration is a good thing. They think it's part of our identity. Now, there are differences. Who should we accept? And I think these are issues that Singapore has to deal with too, in terms of education, how appropriate. But the reality is Americans are an immigrant people. The vast majority of people in the United States today cannot trace their roots back much before about 1870, 1880 in the United States. The two groups that actually have the most degree of Native experience are African Americans and Native Americans. Most white Americans are the descendants of people who came from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Germany being the largest group, and obviously from Scandinavia, Russia, and more recently in very large numbers from Asia and Latin America. Go to the next. And what's really exciting, and I'm working on this right now, we've gone through periods where the immigrants clustered in a few big cities. And in the Northeast during the turn of the century, later on in the late 20th century to places like Los Angeles and West Coast cities. And now actually the largest group of immigrants are going to the South, which was a region that had very little immigration. And they're going for opportunity. If we look at the growth of foreign born in Dallas, it's like 35% over the last decade. And the foreign born numbers in California and New York are actually fairly flat. So immigration is spreading. Again, I believe that natural processes are the healthiest. And, if we could only, take the TV anchors and the politicians away and let people talk to each other, actually, I think you have a much better situation. If we go to the next slide. Now, there is a problem. I consider it a class problem as opposed to a race problem. And in my experience in Singapore, that was also brought out to me that, that the big problem you have is you have a group of people maybe who are not well educated, are having a hard time adjusting, particularly to a very sophisticated economy. That is the crisis that we face. The crisis we face, by the way, is not distinctly a racial crisis. We have the majority of poor people in America are white. Some of our poorest communities are in overwhelmingly white places in parts of the South, in Appalachia, in some of the rural parts of the West. So the real issue, I think, facing us, and I think facing other societies, is really one of economics and of upward mobility or lack of upward mobility. And I would focus on that more than just race itself. Next one, please. And I think this is what Dr. King recognized, that what we really needed to do was to extend opportunity to people, that was the best way for us to proceed as a society and to address those issues. So I think that, it doesn't really help the average poor African-American or Latino in a whether in a small town or in a big city, if we have more quotas for kids to go to Harvard. I don't think that solves the problem. The key thing is, can we bring good jobs? Can we give them good education? Can they get skills? And again, I think this is an area where Singapore, with its excellent education system, I think has really, shown the way. And again, I think we can learn a lot from it. And then I just want to conclude with a little bit of a lyrical note. One of my favorite poets, Walt Whitman, one of the great American poets, and happened to come from the borough that bore me, the borough of Brooklyn, New York. And he said, "What is our goal?" He said, "America is the race of races." And that's really what America is about. And, although I may not agree necessarily with the politics, the fact that our next vice president is half Indian and half West Indian is something. That we had a president who was half white, half from Kenya. I think that we're moving in that direction. If we don't implode, America can still offer the world a very good model, and I hope we get there.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotkin.
Thank you.
That was very, very insightful overview, especially when you look at the United States. Ambassador Alami, would you like to go ahead?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. Can I have my slides, please? Yeah, I will touch on 3 points in the next 15 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Yeah, Let me begin by saying that identity and cohesion are existential issues. Next slide, please. And it is Singapore's fortune that they have not been divisive. Identity politics is not rife, and Singapore has managed the issue of cohesion since the early years after its independence. Nevertheless, the problematics with identity and cohesion will never vaporize because race, culture, and religion are primordial matters that generate perennial challenges. And furthermore, they are part of the social determinants that historically have been proven to be the causal factors for the decline and demise of nations. Next slide, please. And this is where I'd like to quote the work of John Bagot Club. And he found that a time cycle for nations to rise to greatness, decline to, and perish is about 250 years. And this figure does not really change over a timeline of 3,000 years. Economic factors cause the rise, and social determinants cause the decline and demise of nations and empires. Now, the fear of the existential threat of identity and cohesion is deep-seated in Singapore's national consciousness. Even though the country is on the ascending part of the curve, is doing well, very well economically, and we are far away from the 250-year time deadline that Glubb talked about. The threat comes from internal and external factors. When the social fabric of Singapore is exposed to the stresses of the conflictual forces and the competing pools, the strain of competing pools, of when religions, cultures, and ethnicities encounter each other, and when they encounter with the state and politics. Now, let me go into Singapore now. We will be as ever diverse as we can be, but a big difference is that the rate of diversity, the rate of growth of diversity will not be as phenomenal as it used to be in the earlier decades, but the diversity will grow in complexity. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, this is where I see that in the coming years, there will be an uptrend of this sentiment of exclusivism and intolerance, generally speaking, by people and groups, who assert their superiority with regard to their belief. And they ostracize and they tend to alienate those who do not support or agree with them. This is what we call the cancel culture, which I think is emerging in Singapore, and it can be divisive. Now, this sentiment of exclusivism and intolerance, I think, will be made worse by what I see as a probable spillover effects from events in the region. We can see the region near and far from Singapore wrought with conflicts, serious ones, because they are in the intersection between religion, ethnicity, and culture. Now, I don't expect the radicalism or extremism or violence to take root in Singapore because our religious communities have built the religious resilience and robustness over the last 50 years to fend against all these evil forces. But I'm more worried about the silent killer. And these are the sentiments of intolerance, hatred, and exclusivism which undergird radicalism and extremism, which may quietly seep through our borders, get embedded in local teachings, and get preached to the local population. And this will provide the legitimacy for the impulses for groups and individuals, to be exclusive, to show hatred, and to be intolerant, and thereby intensifying the competition for influence, space, and authority. Now, of course, the region, you can see a lot of, there's an uptrend of politicization of religion, there's theologizing of politics, repression of ethnic minorities, and intolerance towards cultural diversity. Now, but the comforting thing about Singapore, I think, Prof, you mentioned this in your preamble, is that, we have a powerful term, a word called harmony, which the state has effectively used for the last 30 years to, in a way, as a form of social control to ensure social peace in legislation, in policies, and so on. But here I'd like to quote Jacqueline News and U.S. Law in her paper to the German Law Journal, which she argued that the word norm has been, the word harmony has been socially normed. It is a powerful norm amongst the citizens. It is used as a kind of extra legal mechanism, whereby they can invoke the term harmony against groups or individuals and say you stop being hateful, you stop being intolerant, you stop being exclusivist. So the word harmony has been socially normed, and that in a way gives it a kind of mutually constraining effect on citizens, on groups and individuals. So I think that is a mitigating factor for this uptrend of intolerance and exclusivism. Can I have the next slide, please? Then I'd like to move on to religion state. Still on the challenging trajectory, there will be very difficult moments of state versus religion. As both state and religion grapple with this whole notion of problem space used by anthropologist David Scott, whereby the central question in play will be where to draw the dividing lines between state, the religion, and politics. And we feed the whole ensemble of sub-questions and sub-questions, how much can religion encroach to public space? How much of religion can interfere in politics? How much can state get involved in the affairs of religion? And all this because religion is grappling with the state and trying to seek more concessions from the state in the practice and embrace of religion. Next, please. I move on to religion, non-religion, which is, I think it will grow bigger in the coming years. And I think the impact on cohesion will be serious. People of no religion have been neglected. They are very much on the sideline. And I think they are going to jostle their way in and get a seat at the table because they believe that even without religion, we are spiritual. The whole idea of spirituality without faith. And we have the wisdom and this moral sensibility to contribute to public reason and public morality. And public reason and public morality are the operating principles to ensure social order in the secular context. But people of religion say, hey, hold on, you don't have any sacred text, you don't have supreme text, and hence you lack the wisdom to contribute to public reason and public morality. So the tension will play itself out. Tension will continue, and I think it will rise. Next slide, please. But the biggest threat, and I thought the biggest factor will be the impact of cultural diversity on our cohesion. And here I like to use the typology of Bhikkhu Pare. He listed three main types of cultural diversity: subcultural diversity, perspectival diversity, and communal diversity. First, subcultural diversity. People of subcultures, I think generally they embrace many elements of mainstream culture, but they differ fundamentally in particular areas of life like sexuality, sexual orientation, lifestyle, marriage, family, children, upbringing, and so on and so forth. Now, they feel that they're part of Singapore, and they are seeking for respect, for equal for recognition, and for the space. And in the name of multiculturalism, they say that they are a critical part of the Singaporean identity. But mainstream people from mainstream society and say, hold on, guys, we also believe in multiculturalism, but we understand it differently. We understand multiculturalism as being institutionalized around the core or the centrality of a dominant culture. And all other lifestyles or all other subcultures will be located on the periphery, of the dominant culture. And they are prepared to live and let that live, so long as people of subculture do not undermine dominant culture or push the lines or the boundaries, to seek and to challenge and to crusade or to champion for changes in legislation, policies, or decisions. Now, the state will not allow the culture war to erupt. They will govern based on societal norms and in a non-partisan way. And then, of course, the state has the power to even deviate from this, as and when they feel that it is in the interest of the nation to do so. I think we need to keep quite a watchful eye on the subcultural diversity. Next slide, please. Perspectival diversity, and the primary actors are the young people. And here, young people are very aware, and they are very perspectival now. They have perspectives and opinions on a whole range of issues, including sensitive issues of race, religion, culture, even difficult subjects of gender, class, sexuality, lifestyle, and so on and so forth. And they are doing this not because for the just sake of knowledge or for knowing, because they are socially conscious and they want to become socially engaged. And I think this is a phenomenon of what we call intersectionality, which is emerging in Singapore, and also the phenomenon of woke, where there's much attention given to racial and social justice. So young people, their aspiration is for the mainstream society to, in a way, review the primary values and principles that govern society to be more aligned to what they believe and what they aspire for the new Singaporean society. So I think this will play itself out in the coming years, and how serious it will be will depend on how well society manages in the conversation and the engagement with the young people. And of course, the young people are very much influenced or motivated by values and ideals which mainstream society thought are quite alien to them. Ideals of human rights, of liberty, of freedom, very much taken from the West. But ideals and values and principles which are valuable but cherished by local society have a less important bearing on the perspectives of the young today and moving on. Next slide, please. Communal diversity. Very much set, established, because I think this is a diversity of the established, well-organized communal ethnic communities in Singapore, and also the immigrant communities which have established themselves in Singapore. I think Singapore's multiculturalism has a bandwidth to absorb, and to embrace such a wide range of diversity. And I think generally Singaporeans open and to embrace the ethnic other. That means if you are Chinese or Malay, you are quite generally embracing of the non-Malays. And also they are quite welcoming of the cultural other, who are the foreigners or the new arrivals. But I think there's a big qualifier. And here I'd like to state that I think it's very much economic. Prof, you mentioned Martin Luther King's, that resonated very much with me. I think it's very much economic driven. We need the economic prosperity to hold the country together. We need the economic wealth, for national unity, national solidarity, and social cohesion. I think without that, it's difficult to hold the country together. And I think the pandemic has shown this. But I'm glad to also say that the latest figures from the public sector shows that income has risen all around, especially the bottom 20%, the 20%, the lowest 20 percentile. Their income has risen faster than the median. And also the Gini coefficient has reduced to less than 0.4. And I think this will have positive impact of bearing on inter-ethnic, inter-communal relations. Can I have the next slide, please? However, I think there are segments within society that feel deprived, feel left out, feel disadvantaged. And the social divides are not only along conventional or traditional lines of income levels, but new emerging social stratifications, technological competencies, whether you're digitally literate or digital literate, or whether you're technologically well-resourced, whether you are PC-owning family or PC-deprived family, and of course, this local and foreign divide. So I think these are the kind of social divisions, emerging ones, that will have an impact to deepen the social fault lines. But of course, our idea, our dream of becoming a truly inclusive Singapore has not materialized, and it's still a work in progress, and there are numerous initiatives to achieve a leveling up of our society. A little bit on national identity. This is a contested idea. In the 80s and 90s, people challenge this and say, no, there's no such thing as national identity attached to geography or to a time-bound or space-bound economy. And the idea that we always hear is that we are global citizens. The world is a global village. We are part of the global economic playing field. But I think the events of the last few years and the trends of rising populism, xenophobia, economic nationalism has in a way made people rethink. And I think there is a kind of return to a more conventional, more traditional understanding of national identity tied to geography, defending your national sovereignty or national territorial rights and so on. Second, a sense of community tied to a community and where social stability is important. And finally, of course, economy, which is tied to a national economy for your prosperity and wealth. So national identity, I think post-pandemic, I think there will be a rethink. I think there will be changes, and it's something which we need to look at. Next slide, please. And I like to end off with 3 ideas for the future, because I see that diversity is going to be complex. And if nothing is done, I'm afraid that the threat will be towards the social polarization of society. And I think just like how we did well in terms of harmony, social norming of harmony over the last 30 years, to fend off, to achieve harmony, I think that we need to try to get our Singaporeans as a society to we preserve the spirit of openness, of humility, to learn from each other, the spirit to mutually benefit from each other. This whole idea of principle of mutuality, and of course, all these spirits are embodied in the whole idea of dialogue. And I'm a firm believer of dialogue, and I like to see Singapore in the next 10, 20 years, to move towards to be a dialogical society. Let us socially norm dialogue. And I think this is a good panacea or a good antidote towards social polarization. Second, I like to suggest, and this for us to think together, is we have a good model of secularism that works for us, very pragmatic way of governing society. And Singapore's secularism, the essence is, it's an eclectic model. No fixed typology of Singapore secularism. Its essence comes from a wide range of types of secularism. And I think we can, and I think we can challenge ourselves here to further enrich or further strengthen our secularism model, to give religions and the collectivity of beliefs space in the political realm. This rich diversity of religions, cultures, and beliefs have a role to play to contribute and enrich our public morality and public reason. And for a start, probably a voice in parliament, that say, the religion sector being given a voice in parliament through the nominated member of parliament scheme. And finally, of course, we are living in a world of unknown scenario planning. I don't think it's fully effective. I think we need to find a tool to develop frames of mind amongst the citizens, so that with frames of mind, give it people the psychological reflexes to encounter a very difficult world moving on, when unknowns were more likely to appear today. So, and I think this whole idea of two frames of mind, that come to my mind straight away, this embrace of inclusivity and embrace of diversity that sets the frame of mind for us to stay together, whether you have a tornado or a storm or, difficult times with unknowns, at least we'll stay together to enrich the modus vivendi for Singapore that holds us together. So I'll just stop here and we can have our discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for looking in the crystal ball and telling us some of the issues that will be important for us in Singapore. It's a great time now to hear from Mei Ling and then from Daniel, some thoughts from, as you have heard, these two presentations. Ms. Fang, would you first want to start?
Yes. I could go on for 30 minutes on what I've heard from Professor Kotkin and Professor Alami. I want to talk about digital and the effect of the digital revolution on what is going on in identity and cohesion. This is one of the largest structural changes that we're going to see, not just in our lifetime, perhaps in 200 or 300 years. We are looking at a digital tsunami upon us that is changing all academic disciplines, all industries, and all our manners of communication. So I want to touch on what I can see as an overseas Singaporean. Sometimes it's easier to see things that are hard to see from inside the island. I see the diaspora and the diversity of diaspora creating a global community that Singapore could be using to help to surf these digital waves, that there is a perspective that the diaspora have, we as overseas Singaporeans. But similarly, the people who are in Singapore and around the world, they are all diaspora. The world is becoming an immigrant society. The idea of harmony as an extra legal mechanism is particularly delightful to me, because I think this is where Singapore is a real model for diaspora and how to integrate in society. I have a vision of 4-part harmony, people understanding that you can have different melodies and everybody doesn't have to sing the same song to have a rich life and culture. I ask us to look for the tapestry of weaving together the human fabric, that to take the digital tsunami as a way to move into what is the new human fabric that we can weave. And Singapore is truly a model for this. Global youth are looking for new models, and there are few multicultural models that are as well respected as Singapore. President Kagame of Rwanda says he wants to be the Lee Kuan Yew of Africa. So as we look at this rise and fall of nations model of 250 years, we are still young. Singapore is still young, 50 years in, 60 years in. So it's still going up. What is the model of cohesion that we can actually help the rest of the world do? Help the rest of the world deal with these conflicts and the digital tsunami. That model is strategic pragmatism. That is the story of Singapore's economic development, adaptability, flexibility, the willingness to make hard decisions, but the mathematical modeling of what the future could be, and then deciding, okay, we're going to find a way to navigate through this. We have to deal with the silent killers, but we won't do it by just waiting for them to attack. We have to come together and deliberately and with intention take the wonderful models of health, education, transportation, and share them with the world. Singapore can rise and be more cohesive with economic growth and help many, many other countries. Let us make President Kagame's dream true. Let him be the Lee Kuan Yew of Africa, and let Singapore help do that. And not just for Africa, but the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mei Lin. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
Hi, yeah, thanks to Prof. Cockin and Ambassador Alami for the great presentation. I think it's a timely reminder that, we still have that primary division or fault line, which is ethnic identity with us, right, in Singapore. And I'm saying this because I'm going to be a bit of, and I've heard a lot of very positive things that I really agree with, right? The modern multiculturalism in Singapore and whatnot, which I've also expressed in my writings and in my work. But I'm going to be a bit of a prophet of doom and gloom, and point out to three, I think, issues that I think will be especially prevalent in the next 10 to 20 years with regards to cohesion in Singapore. And it all happens to start with the letter I. So the first one is intersectionality, and this is a concept that has been discussed in academia, but I think in Singapore it takes on a peculiar kind of historical gloss because the ethnic identity is starting to intersect with gender, sexual, new religious, immigrant and nativist kind of identities that's coming up hard and fast. I don't have time to give examples, but I think many in the audience will be able to say something about this. And I would say that some of these intersectional identities, like gender and sexual identities and religious identities are actually becoming more significant, right, than the ethnic identity. So post-ethnicity or post-ethnic identities do have another side today, which is that it brings up other issues and other identity politics along its wake. The second I is importation of ideas, identities, and the prospect of the culture war, which Ambassador Alami brought up. And I think I'm seeing this a lot more, and he mentioned the young people especially are giving into woke ideas, and then also there are new forms of identities that are coming, especially LGBTQ identities, and also new religious identities like ideas from the Christian right that's coming from the US, that's coming to Singapore. So all these factors are actually quite important because I don't think it's going to remain as subcultural. I think for many of these people who believe and who buy into these identities and ideas, they are becoming mainstream for them, right? So what it means is that there's going to be a much more heated kind of exchange and struggle over such ideas as the years come by. The third issue is integration. I mean, we have not been discussing this as much, I think, in this forum. But I think the integration of immigrants, which make up about 1/3 of the population, I think is a crucial issue. And while the Gini coefficient is going down, especially for the local residents, I think the problem is that we do see a stark inequality that happens within the immigrant section, right? And what I mean is this, right? That you have the more skilled, talented immigrants coming in, and they're occupying certain spaces in the city. And that would be the condos, the private apartments, and residences. And then you have those who live in dormitories, which are the lower skilled, low wage workers. In some ways, we have an issue, I think, of integrating these two, and they kind of also represent the kind of inequality within the immigration sector. I mean, I've already seen some cases in which whether young or middle-aged Singaporeans going into politics or getting political, right, because they're upset about these two issues. And they're coming from very different spectrums in the political spectrum, coming from the more conservative, nativist, xenophobic kind of spectrum, and the other one coming from a more progressive, woke kind of spectrum. So I think these issues will come to head in the next 10 years, especially once COVID settles down. Economy is back. The economy is going to be back on full steam. Everyone's bouncing back. All these issues, I think, will come aboard in a much more heated way. So we have to be prepared to address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that. The 3 I's, very, very insightful 3 I's to think about. All right. I mean, we've heard some excellent presentations and great discussion points from our esteemed panelists. It's time now to hear some of your thoughts. I know many of you have already put out thoughts on Pigeonhole, and that's where we're taking our questions from. I know some of them have, we have some on Pigeonhole, which has been voted quite a bit, 16 votes, 11 votes, and all that. So we'll get to the top votes in a few minutes, but I wanted to first give space to the first question that was asked when I turned on the Pigeonhole earlier, which was really a question from, I think it's Matthew Ting. And I think this speaks about, Matthew Ting's question was about ethnic discrimination in the United States, which has increased during the in the last few months during the pandemic, and its relationship to political rivalries. And I'm sure Professor Kotkin, you can talk a little bit about that. But I think what's more interesting to us also is that how some of that can play out. And I think this is an important dimension. Things that are happening in the US and other parts of the world, particularly in the US, have quite a bit of spillover effect in the rest of the world. And so I'm just wondering whether that would be something for us to think about and deliberate. So maybe can I just start with Professor Kotkin, and then anyone in the panel can go ahead and give your thoughts.
Okay, first of all, in terms of what's happened with COVID, which I've worked on very hard, and we have probably, we've tried to break it down. First of all, the virus doesn't care what race you are. I mean, that's not, that what has happened is that certain groups in the society, mainly poor people living in overcrowded housing, people who don't have education, don't have access to good health care, those are the ones who've suffered the most. I don't think that there's necessarily any greater or lesser ethnic discrimination, but what the COVID has done is it's accelerated the inequality that is beyond any racial characteristics. I mean, there's some a relationship in that there are more poor Hispanics and African Americans, for instance. But the real issue is one of class, and I think one of the basic things I think that Mei Lin brought up, which I really think was because I write a lot about this myself, the ability of technology to allow the upper classes, whatever their ethnicity, to work at home and to essentially continue their lives, a little bit inconvenienced, is very different than the lives of people who work in hotels, or the people who work at airports, or the people who have been affected, particularly the small business people. And by the way, that is a very diverse group. They've been hit the hardest, and many of them are from immigrant groups. I know in talking to my social media person, the Muslim community here in Orange County is incredibly entrepreneurial. They own all sorts of businesses. They're getting destroyed. It's not an issue. Again, I think it's an issue of race, and it to some extent, but it's mostly an issue of class, and even an issue of what way you make a living. So, for instance, if you're a public employee, or you are in a bureaucracy where your job is fundamentally protected, or if you work at a tech company, you're probably in good shape. But if you work in a certain kind of company, and you can be a well-educated, successful person, but if you're an airline pilot, let's say an airline pilot, but the planes aren't flying. And so again, I think it's more sort of structural and class-driven. Now, my book and most of my work focuses on the issue of class, and I think that is where the divisions are. I don't think racial division is actually worse. Actually, even after the Floyd disorders, actually the number of African Americans killed by police is down from where it was 10 years ago. So I think the issues are fundamentally those of class, and I think the issues have been made more extreme because of the digital tsunami that was mentioned. Because, for instance, someone like me, you know what? I mean, my living hasn't been really affected, and so but I think for many other people, it's been catastrophic. And again, it depends on where you are in the economy and whether you can be able to do your work online.
Thanks, Professor Kotkin. I'm thinking more about the hate that, or at least in the early part of the pandemic, there was quite a bit of concern about ethnic Chinese. I think it's not just in the US, also in Canada. And of course, later on, with people talking about the China virus and matters like that. So whether that has exacerbated hate or is just purely political, and of course, some of the ramifications. I didn't know whether Mei Ling had any thoughts. If not, we'll move on to the next question. And
I think we should move on to the next question.
Okay, great. So let's move on to, this is a question that I think and maybe closely connected to the whole idea about importation of ideas. And I was just thinking about, I mean, in the US, of course, when you have much of the notion about the privilege of different groups, which maybe more and more aware about. In Singapore, we've also had the idea about Chinese privilege, because obviously Chinese being the majority. I'm just thinking about some of your thoughts about that. Anyone had some thoughts? Maybe I'll first get Daniel, because Daniel has written recently about the notion about Chinese privilege, and you mentioned it just now. And if anybody else would think about some of the usefulness of importing some of these ideas within the local space.
Well, I think ideas have their origins, but ideas don't have that kind of nationalistic imprint in that it belongs to a certain people. Ideas travel, right? So importation of ideas is not an issue, but I think the question is whether our indigenous intellectual traditions are able to absorb and adapt these ideas to make them relevant to our society, make them relevant to our history. Right. I think the problem with the concept Chinese privilege is that it is under discussed, under specified. I think if those who want to advance this idea and to use it in the social sciences, to use it, to in public discourse, to understand some of the certain realities of like racism and prejudice in Singapore, they have to specify it. It cannot be something that is just simply equivalent to white privilege, because America had a very different history regards to racial relations as compared to Singapore. Singapore is a post-colonial country with racial categories that are left over by colonial structures, by the British and the way they saw and stereotyped the different native people in Malaya, right? So we have a very different history. So the question is, how do we then talk about, let's say, something like Chinese privilege within the history, within the kind of intellectual traditions in Singapore? And that's my worry about importation of ideas, that we do not focus enough, I think, on our own intellectual traditions in Singapore. We don't respect our previous thinkers and bring them up, and then integrate ideas that are imported elsewhere into these traditions. So I'm worried about the resilience of our indigenous intellectual traditions and the borrowing wholesale, right, of ideas and concepts from other places that will be maladapted, right? You can't use it in any way. So in a lot of cases in which people talk about Chinese privilege, they bring up examples that have already been discussed in academic works as basically, racial prejudice, racial stereotyping, racial discrimination, or structural racism, institutional racism. So in terms of concepts, the usefulness of Chinese privilege is not there, because we already have concepts to describe these things and to explain these things as part of the issues that we have to deal with as a society. So, but if you bring in something like Chinese privilege, you are borrowing the history of another society in without being critical. And sometimes you end up with consequences like blaming all the Chinese in Singapore, for example, of a problem that is actually very, very historical and very structural and based on institutional racism, which we have to solve as a kind of trans ethnic with kind of unity, right, as one people. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. Ambassador Alami, do you have some thoughts? And then I'll pass it to Mei-Lian. You unmute yourself, Ambassador.
I think Daniel has said it very well already. I do not think that you can just also generalize such concept. It's very very loaded idea and concept, and just like racism, you cannot just say that we are a racist country or racism exists, but you really need to study the context, the situation and the setting, and then I think the idea becomes clearer, and your conclusions are more justifiable conclusions. So I agree with Daniel that you need to contextualize to our culture and to our history. I think that's all that I'd like to add on. Yeah.
Thank you. Mei-Lian, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really am agitated by this idea of Chinese privilege, and I really think that if Lee Kuan Yew was here, he would really stomp on it. I think it's legitimate to do that. I happen to have actually been looking at the comparison of the Singapore health system and the American health system. Singapore spends 25% less than the American system, but people are bringing ideas from the American health system into Singapore, where Singapore is so much better. People in the US would just be in heaven to have Singapore's system of health. And so I think this idea of white privilege translated to Chinese privilege is not just a shortcut, but like lack of thinking. And I think the answer should be the dialogic society that Professor Alami brought up, that these things should be argued out, and the intellectual scarcity of an idea like Chinese privilege, just using that as an argumentation idea that you brought from another country that doesn't apply is ridiculous.
Just I have to agree completely on this one, because I think the idea of white privilege is absurd. If you spend time in this country, you'll see lots of poor white people. I love to hear white privilege from Asian Americans who actually have higher incomes and education than the whites do. I mean, I think we have to I think the dialogue is very important. And I also want to say the ambassador hit, I think, one of the places that I'm most sensitive, which is you have to have economic growth and aspiration. If people are much less concerned about people's privilege if they're moving upward. But if you're not going upward, and then you can blame somebody else, I think it's a real problem. So I think that this whole idea of taking an entire ethnicity, because I know even in Singapore, there are poor Chinese. There are Chinese who are struggling, particularly immigrants. So, to categorize whole groups. I mean, when there was in the COVID debate, there are people saying, well, we shouldn't inoculate old people because they're mostly white, and therefore it's unfair. Well, old people are the ones who are dying. I mean, what, is this really hard to get through to people? My 90-year-old mother-in-law, maybe she should be ahead of the line from a very healthy 22-year-old person who happens to be of a different ethnicity. I think this concept is so destructive, and so, as a lot of my African American friends say, disempowering. Basically saying that you were born with this, and this is going to define you all your life, and that, I think, is, whether it's the American dream or the Singapore dream, this has no place in a successful society.
Excellent. Let me move on to and take another question, which is quite a few votes here. This is, I think this goes to really a fundamental way when we think about society. I think we have 16 votes here, which has got to do with a question about, is it more intuitive and realistic to expect tolerance rather than assimilation in a diverse society? Should we actually work towards assimilation or be comfortable with differences? So, I guess the difference, or the, I don't know whether they're polar opposites, but the Singapore model where you kind of work towards building tolerance, accept the fact that there are quite people who are very different, or the model where we say everybody become somewhat the same, and perhaps that might work. So I guess a different model in multiculturalism. Quick takes for that. Maybe you'd start with Professor Kok-Kin.
Well, I think that fundamentally people, the idea of assimilation has been, and sort of the melding, which you can go back to Theodore Roosevelt talking about, there's no room for hyphenated Americans. I think that idea has sort of run itself out. First of all, the country is infinitely more diverse. The second thing is the Anglo-Saxons are not necessarily doing better than a lot of the other ethnic groups. Actually, most of the ethnic groups that were looked down upon when they got here have done better than the Anglo-Saxons have done. So this idea of everyone trying to be the same, I think is, by the way, part of the problem. And the ambassador probably be familiar with the way that the French have tried to put incredible restrictions on, whether, wearing a burqa or wearing a kippah. I think that's not the way we're going to go. Because the other thing is this: we live in a global society. We are connected globally. So if I want to know what's going on in Israel, I can know that instantaneously. If my when I talk to the local imam about what's happened with COVID in the local mosque, he says the biggest change is now the people are not necessarily going to the local mosque, but they're listening to a particular preacher in Africa or a particular preacher in Dallas. So, the reality is people are going to be able to get new inputs that were not available. When you moved from Sweden to Minnesota in 1890, your children were very likely to become assimilated in a way that they may not be assimilated today. And I think the biggest issue is we should let people choose how assimilated they want to be, what kind of identity they want to be. And I'm very much aligned with my own particular ethnic culture. I don't see anything contradictory about going to the synagogue and being an American. I don't think going to a mosque or going to a Episcopal church, whatever it is you want to do, it's really about letting people define themselves. And and this is one of the good things in a digital universe is we have that ability in a way that we never had it before.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Can I? Yeah. The idea of one culture or national culture, it's a characteristic of pre-modern society.
Mhm.
It doesn't make sense anymore of having, a national culture or one unified culture needed for stability. I think it's no longer valid. Let's look at us. How did this nation come about? It came about because we wanted to depart, from a system where there is a dominant race, religion, and way of life, right? And that's why we broke away. We said, no, that's not the way to govern society. We want to give everybody the respect, the space, the recognition. And hence multiculturalism became a principal tenet, of our ideology besides secularism and meritocracy, right? And it's our whole idea is to, to absorb the diversity at the same time to have a kind of common platform where people can coexist, with the harmony and the peace. So I think, certainly multiculturalism is here to stay. I mean, if you don't have multiculturalism, what's the opposite is monoculturalism. And I think, and monoculturalism is what kind of culture are we talking about? Is it a dominant culture? So are we going to be a Chinese country or Chinese Buddhist, Chinese Taoist country? No, but we've decided, and this is part of the social contract where minorities have embraced, the whole idea that we are equally respected, we have equal place in this country, equal equal recognition. So I think this is, and of course, then how do you, what I said earlier about this modus vivendi, the common grounds, the common platform, which back in 1965, the first president has already defined a three-part modus vivendi, which was further refined by our current president, Halimah Yacob, during the International Conference of Cohesive Society. But that's the modus vivendi, and how do you then live out the multiculturalism? Well, I hear Matthew said about tolerance, but that's not enough, that's the most basic level of tolerance. We need to go to understanding, the intermediate level, and even high aspiration of appreciation, of our different cultures, language, religion, beliefs, and what you have. I think this is what I meant by towards the dialogical society and enriching our whole common grounds as a people of great diversity. We are the most diverse, Professor Kotking. Singapore is the most religious diverse country in the world. Pew Center Research did a study, and we are the most religious diverse country in the world. So, and I think, we need the common grounds. Yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I just want to say that interesting that this idea of assimilation is coming into Singapore, and it happened, I think, close to us in Australia in the 1950s, and we saw what dramatic kind of racism that kind of brought up, and it's also kind of close by in Northeast Asia, where Japan and Korea have at one time, been very quite anti-immigrant and has always been trying to assimilate the different cultures, but they've really moved away from that into more multicultural ground. We can possibly see this in China today. So I think it is kind of dangerous to even consider it as an option in Singapore, because we have always been part of island Southeast Asia. Island Southeast Asia, basically Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, right? We are very diverse, right? And with migrant peoples and diasporic people moving around, and the main issue for us since independence has always been about integration. So you see in Indonesia you have Pancasila, in Malaysia you have multiracialism, right, in their own terms, and we have our own multiracialism. Even the Philippines, they have issues with concerns about making sure that you have the different regional groups, right, having a share of power and part of the Filipino identity. The very identity of being a Filipino is already a mixed identity, right? So what we have here in island Southeast Asia is a model of diversity and multiculturalism that was already here for centuries, way before the colonial powers came, colonized us, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do is to make sure that we have these intellectual traditions of multiculturalism revive and resilient.
Thanks, Anil. Let me, and I'm sure Million will have thoughts as well, but maybe let me just jump to the other question, which is also quite a lot of votes on that one. And I think it's closely related to this big discussion about assimilation and, I guess the idea about multiculturalism or the Singapore version of that. And that has got to do with the CMIO model, because if you think about the CMIO model, it kind of enshrines the fact that we do have some kind of diversity, and that's very much part of our population makeup in Singapore. CMIO, of course, if we do national polls, we do find that some people, this small proportion, who normally would say, forget it, let's just abandon it, just have a Singapore identity. We don't want to have any classification based on our different ethnic backgrounds, just all treat ourselves as Singapore or Singaporean. And then, of course, there are others who would say, hey, maybe we should be moving towards a more nuanced approach. So it should not be C dash something else, and a lot more of a hyphenated Singapore Chinese, Peranakan or something like that. So there are a lot more categories there. So, of course, I think the question is asking about what would be the preconditions to reconsider some of this towards a more nuanced approach. But I guess we can think about this a little broadly. So we'll start with Mei-Lian, if your thoughts, and then anybody else would like to jump in.
Yeah, I think that, in fact, part of multiculturalism is really understanding that everyone has roots, and our cultural roots are important. What I think Singapore has as a model, and we need to reinforce this, is the appreciation of all our different cultural roots. It is, in fact, that grounding in your ancestors and where you came from and where they came from, and they might have been from all over. But you are the product of roots, and those roots will give us centering and stability in this new world of digital tsunami, because it's our human roots that will allow us to be cohesive and have a sense of real identity, and where people can't just pretend or trick you into thinking you've got another identity and get you into being in conflict with somebody else. If you understand your roots, you know where you're coming from, you know what your ancestors sacrificed to let you be here, and you have an obligation to the people who come after you, those roots will keep us cohesive. And that's the sense of national identity that I see that Singapore has, that allows it to be the Venice of the modern era. Venice is at the cultural crossroads, and Singapore is at the global crossroads. It was at the physical global crossroads with shipping, and now with Business Sans Borders, these initiatives that are coming out, Singapore can be global e-commerce crossroads. So we need to appreciate everybody's roots and bring us together in this human tapestry.
Okay, so let's Professor Kotkin very quickly, and then Daniel. We can't hear you. You're muted.
One of the things also is part of that is in many cases a religious and cultural inheritance. People growing up with no sense of, and I find this with my students. I find now that even though I'm not Christian, I'm teaching them about the New Testament because they didn't learn it from their parents. This has been a huge change. And I think that there needs to be, whether it's a religious background or an ethnic background, some sort of sense of principle that is something other than something from the digital era, something that has permanence, that has long-term effects. Like, for instance, my youngest daughter this summer, given that she can travel, is going to Poland to see where her basically where her own great grandfather died. And I think it's an important thing for people to understand that they have this tradition, this thing that's very rich. I was fortunate enough to speak in Medina in 2019, and you felt this tremendous power of that tradition. And I think that makes our life so much richer than this sort of YouTube, TikTok kind of world. I'm not saying that that's bad, but if you don't come into it with any sense of values, how do you know what's right? How do you know what's wrong? How do you know how you're supposed to treat people? So I think that is really important, because the internet isn't going to teach us how to treat people. We're going to learn that from religion. We're going to learn it from our families. We're going to learn it from our past.
Thank you. Professor Goh?
Yeah, I'm just going to add in that I think the CMI model is I think not so much a model as a starting point to get into the richness and the complexities of our diversity. We should not let it become a grid, right, which will become very rigid as something that is imposed on everything, to making sure everything must have CMIO in it. But I think it's a very good starting point. For example, I mean, when I start talking to people who come to visit Singapore, my friends from overseas, I tell them about CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, others, as the makeup of our country. And I start talking about myself as Chinese, but then I start going to all my family history and bore them to death, right, about how I was a Teochew 3 to 4 generations ago, peasant family, escaping, persecution, religious persecution, because one side of the family was Catholic, and so on and so forth. So it becomes, a very rich tapestry of diversity. And then I start talking about intermarriages, between, like they have a Peranakan branch in the family, marrying into Malay culture, and so on and so forth. So I think it is a starting point. So it's a very good starting point. So we should not let it become a rigid grid, but we should, let it remain as a starting point.
Matthew? Yeah. I think we cannot run away from the fact that human beings are culturally embedded, and it's very difficult for a cross-cultural valid vision for a good life. I mean, we see France, they more or less homogenize and say, no, it's only one identity, the French identity, French values, the Republican values. Minorities have no place, no space, And is that the way that we want to go? You take away all our unique identities, and what do we become? A Singaporean? What's a Singaporean? So it becomes you are, and to me, you're losing so much richness in the diversity that we have. And I remember, Matthew, I think IPS did a study on the CIMO, and generally people can still accept the CIMO model, but they only ask for an extension or expansion of that model. So I thought I added in the word E, CIMEO, E is Eurasians, But of course, like what Lin Fang said, that Peranakan and so on. So I think we need to find a way to accommodate people's aspiration to identify the way that they want to be identified with. So I think we in a way, we have been discussing this for a long time. We haven't really got a good formula for this, but I think we need to think carefully. And people who don't want to be identified with any cultural group, what do you do with them? So we need to think all this. Yeah. Okay.
I assume, Professor Alami, Ambassador, you're not asking for an immediate revisit of the model, or do you think that we should start revisiting the model?
No, I think the model can remain. It can be expanded, but you find a way how to accommodate a much more diversity in the aspiration of how people want to identify themselves.
Great. Let me move on to the other question about religious diversity, which has got quite a number of votes. And I want to look at the question that Carol posed, and also what Ambassador you mentioned just now, which is quite interesting. You said, well, we should have a seat in NMP. One of them should be someone from the religious side of the house and provide inputs from a religious point of view, which seems to be quite, antithetical to the secular model, which we feel we've normally embraced, arguably. And then, of course, Carol is saying, hey, we should increase the space because the increasing proportion of those who have no religion, and that's about 20% of our population. 20% does not necessarily mean that they have completely, they embrace an atheistic position. They might have various notions about religion. But anyway, there's a portion who don't have a very clear affiliation. They too should have a seat in policy-making deliberations. So what do you think about that? Should we now bring religious voices into the public space in these different arenas? What are some of the downsides of doing that? And what are potentially some of the upsides? And somebody want to, Professor Alami, since you started off that first, maybe just if I can get some others to reflect first, and then we'll get back to you.
Yeah. No, I think scholars across the globe, scholars of secularism are now questioning the basic tenet, whether this separation between religion, politics, and state, is it real? Is it something which have been wrongly defined? In fact, many scholars in the 60s, 70s believe, you should totally get religion out of public space. But there is a big rethink amongst us in the world of scholarship, religious scholarship. And they felt that, no, it's not possible to take away religion, which is a big dimension of human life, away from people, whether even in public space. I think there's a talk about, trying to bring religion back, but there's a big qualifier though, because as you know, it can be divisive. Of course, there are books written on that even politics is religious, politics is religious. So I don't think there can be a strict line between religion, politics, and state. I think there are overlaps, and I believe that religion, and I use the word collectivity of beliefs, Matthew, religion and collectivity of beliefs. So it's a bit broader than just religion, to be given a voice. And I know that the criticism would be, you'll be divisive, but the qualifier is that it has to be the language of the reason. It has to be language of public reason. You don't use sacred text or scripture, to articulate your views and convey your wisdom in the public space. How do you use a language that can be well received by all, regardless of religious affiliation or regardless of whether you are of religion or no religion? So it is a very kind of sophisticated way of dealing with this idea, not just a Buddhist monk goes to parliament or a Christian priest or imam, a Muslim imam in parliament. I think it'll be a tragedy, but we need people with the religious leaders with that kind of mindset, the paradigm, the frame of mind to be able to present to humanity, so to speak, the wonderful wisdom and the gems available, which are present in religions and in beliefs, to the public. So I don't think we should be too anxious about that, this would cause the division, because it has to be the right way of doing things.
To have religious voices or not, let's have Milind, your quick thoughts Joe, did you want to?
The issue actually comes up with algorithms in technology. It's a kind of a weird mix. So there's a kind of a problem when you just take individual voices, because you do not get the investment in the public goods or in the collective well-being. And so politics, religion, and the state give embracing things that give norms and protocols to allow us to invest and pay attention to the need for cohesion and collective goods. Without these ties that bind, we can end up just splintering off. And this is actually a real problem in computer algorithms today, that we are seeing that computer algorithms are causing this divisiveness because we don't have these overarching ties. So it's kind of, there's a book called Algorithms to Live By that made the case for religion, politics, and state.
It's very interesting. Thank you. First, Calkin, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. Just a couple of things. One, although technology is wonderful, to have the world run by technologists is a frightening prospect. As a friend of mine who worked in Silicon Valley said, there's no group of people in the history of the world who know less about the social impact of what they're doing than the techies. They just don't get it. Very few of them have read, whether it's the Constitution or the Bible, or the amount of knowledge that they've had, because let's face it, they're nerds, and they generally they didn't sit around and read Walt Whitman when they were in college, or Nietzsche like I did at Berkeley many years ago, and so there's a limitation. But here's a really exciting and different thing, and this is what I've been working on a lot, which is we're finding religion being redefined by the next generation. Wade Roof, the theologian, Christian theologian, wrote about, he called it the spiritual marketplace. People go from one idea to another idea to another idea, and they integrate those ideas. So it's not necessarily the formal structure. The formal structures of religion are weakening. The spiritual reawakening is growing. And if we can figure out a way to use that to increase the cohesiveness and the harmony of a society, because all good religious ideas are based on some idea of harmony, some idea of improvement. And so we're, in the future, when we think about religion and society, it may be much more of a complex situation, not just a rabbi, a priest, an imam in a room, each with their own particular text. It's going to be much more fluid, just like the way that we deal with race.
Nobody has mentioned about those with no religious affiliation. I know that Ambassador Alami had some thoughts about that. Daniel, do you have any thoughts about that? Should we allow those with, no religious affiliation as a group, as a body, to be able to present, have a seat in policy making in that capacity? Now, obviously, the secular capacity is what all of us take, but very specifically a stance from that no religious position. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I was in Parliament for a few years, and I would say that I don't see the real need for any deliberate kind of representation of religious or secular humanist ideas or viewpoints in Parliament, because they are already done, and when it comes to controversial issues like things like abortion, organ transplant, 377A, right, and the whip is lifted, at least for the ruling party, right? So the whip is lifted, and the religious ideas and viewpoints do get represented in the argumentation and the debate that follow. In any case, even in ordinary debates about policy, I do see when I was in Parliament, my colleagues, my parliamentary colleagues, do bring up their religious viewpoints and standpoints, and humanist standpoints too, very, very eloquently and very respectfully. All right, and so I don't see the need actually to represent these, and I think they are already brought to bear, at least in Parliament. I think that the more interesting and important thing to think about is how do we increase this in the public discourse, right, on the internet, right, on other kind of public fora, to have different religious viewpoints and humanist viewpoints come to bear on these issues and to debate them respectfully. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. We're running out of time, but let me just take a last question. We've dealt with race, dealt with religion, and I think one thing that is of concern to a lot of Singaporeans has got to do with the issue about migration. But Shamil's question about COVID and has shown us how we need to improve our treatment of vulnerable or especially minority groups. And one part is, of course, migrant workers and low-skilled migrant workers who live in dormitories, for instance. He's asking what are some of the legacy factors which we need to decouple and to reset. Are there some things that, in terms of our perspectives, our ways that we have done policy, is something that we have to rethink when we think about migrant work in Singapore? Any thoughts about that?
Just really quickly, I'll just share what we see in the U.S. I've been looking at the fatality maps. They are almost exactly based on where people live in crowded housing. If you look in Los Angeles, for instance, most of the deaths have taken place in East LA, South LA, in poor communities where people, which have the most crowded housing in the United States. If you go to West Los Angeles, in the San Fernando Valley, very low rates. So I think when I read about what was happening in Singapore with the migrant workers, I assume you're seeing similar things with migrant workers in parts of the Middle East, and I know in France, the worst experiences have been in the immigrant communities, and I know that's also the case in Sweden. So I think what happened in Singapore is something that we see other countries too.
Really good thing in Singapore, we've had very, very little fatality among migrant workers, though a lot of infection. Any other thoughts about, any comments about this broader view about migrant workers and in the broader discussion about diversity? Professor Alami, Ambassador, yeah, go ahead. You're muted, Ambassador, yeah.
You know, Singapore, we develop at a rapid pace. You know, our urban planning, our development, we did it in such a short period of time, and of course we need people, you know, to do all this, and of course the policy of taking in a lot of foreign workers. But of course there's a lag between getting in these migrant workers and policies that should have come into action, you know, to make sure that the migrant workers are well taken care of. And of course, this is all economics. You know, you do this, which means that, you know, it has an economic impact on projects and so on. So I thought we're kind of blindsided by that, you know, and I think the COVID, the blessing in disguise is that it's kind of wake-up call, and we are now trying to manage it better, and I think things are getting better. But I think more importantly is regardless of, you know, physical conditions, which are important, but I think the respect that we give to them, you know, as human beings, you know, how we respect and we value foreign workers, whether they are just laborers, you know, working up in the hot sun. How do Singaporeans respect them and to respect their dignity as human beings, you know? So I thought it's something which I think we need to learn as a society, and this is very much part of the culture of inclusivity, not only amongst locals, with foreigners, not only with the haves, you know, but with everybody else in society.
Thank you, Ambassador.
As overseas Singaporeans, this was the most embarrassing thing, that I was embarrassed to be a Singaporean, to hear about dual classes of residents. It was shocking. And so I think Singapore, Singapore is concerned about the global brand. I've been very, very positive about how Singapore can go out. This was a real black eye, and it needs to be fixed. And I hope that the whole Singapore adaptability, flexibility will understand that we do not want to be known in the world as a society that has different classes of residents, some of which can live like an underclass and others who are given CPF. This is not a good look for Singapore.
Any final comments on the migrant issue?
I'll just say something about this in terms of, we I think the government has gotten a lot of flack for this. And rightly so, because I think there must be improvements in policy regulation and whatnot. But it's also important, I think, to turn the lens back to society and to understand that a lot of the housing issues that the migrant workers face came out because there were complaints from Singaporeans to move these migrant workers away from their housing estates, whether it's public and private. I mean, still remember, 2008 Serangoon Gardens, where the government tried to use an old school to house 1,000 migrant workers. Uproar, right, among the private housing residents there, right? So this is not in my backyard, NIMBY kind of attitude. Have to go. It has to go because it is against integration, and it's not about it's disrespectful, right, to echo Ambassador's words. Yeah.
I think it's a great place to end. I think this call of respect for the diversity that we have, whether it's a diversity comes with immigration, diversity of people with different social backgrounds, religion, race. I think that if we can build in us the DNA, which really is here, but I think has to be from time to time tweaked and strengthened, will go a long way as a strong, cohesive society, despite the fact that it's very important for us to allow for a plethora of identities to be present in our country. With that, let me thank all our panelists who have given their time. Really appreciate them for giving us very, very insightful thoughts, and I'm sure you'll probably agree with that. So join me in, let's thank all our panelists for a very, very helpful session. Thank you, all of you. We've come to the end of this session. I just want to mention some quick housekeeping matters that the session has been recorded, and if you'd like to review the recordings of it, you can go to the conference page and you'll be able to watch all the previous sessions, this session and the ones before that. There's another session coming up at 4 p.m. today, Singapore time, on technology and livability. It's been a great session. Thank you very much all for joining us, and also appreciate all the many good questions that many of you have raised up. And we're sorry we couldn't answer all of them, but thank you for posing those questions.
Thank you.